The reason we're here is ProgressOhio has prepared a report that we're releasing along with the Center for Media and Democracy, the People for the American Way, and Common Cause. It's a joint project, part of the ALEC Exposed project. It's aiming at shedding light on one of the most effective, secretive political groups in the country. ALEC is the American Legislative Exchange Committee, and they have passed thousands of bills by their own account in state legislatures across the country. Over half of the members of the current State House are dues-paying members of this organization. It's largely funded, however, by corporate lobbyists. ALEC doesn't release almost anything in terms of other than the required financial disclosure at the national level, but membership lists and details of its events and the legislation that it is trying to get passed in the State House. It doesn't release any of that, and it does all of this as a 501c3 nonprofit. And the report you have today is based on over 1,000 pages of public records requests, and we were able to piece together some really interesting details about how this works out in real life and the profound effect that it's had on our State House. So first I want to introduce Brian Rothenberg, who's going to cover a couple of the incidents from the report and talk about the ethical and political implications of this.
Thanks, Brett. And for those of you who don't know Brett, Brett is our policy director, Brett Thompson. 1P. You will see a report in front of you called ALEC's 7 Deadly Sins. I'm not going to go through all of it, but I am going to highlight things that we found out in our most recent update of public records. Among the most appalling things we found out is that the director of scheduling for the Ohio House Speaker actually tried to rearrange the session dates in 2012 around ALEC events and fundraising events. This is obviously, session is probably the most important thing that the Ohio House does. It tells you the importance of this organization to conservatives in the state and the GOP majority, that they are powerful enough to rearrange the actual voting sessions of the legislature just on behalf of this issue. Senior staff from ALEC advised a legislator handling requests from the press that it would help ALEC out a lot on this issue if they didn't use ALEC model legislation. This is in relation to the voter ID bill. The voter ID bill did pass. I've noticed Bill Seitz said that it did not. Just as a history lesson, the voter ID bill passed and then was later repealed 1 month later, last summer, in the summer of 2011. And much of the legislation, even though it wasn't word for word, it was changed a little bit, but the spirit and most of the words were very similar to ALEC model legislation. Hundreds of State House emails have been used in this process to schedule social events at conferences and dinners with lobbyists at ALEC events. You will find in here that the staff member for Representative Adams was actually at one point trying to hide the existence of one of the legislative leaders because she was juggling scheduling different members with different lobbyists and corporations for dinner at an event in New Orleans. This shows you the point at which they have tried to get around ethics laws, but they are trying to clearly coordinate and use these efforts to coordinate with lobbyists. Despite ALEC's claims of being nonpartisan, legislative staff circulated a membership recruitment letter to Republicans only, hardly indicative of a bipartisan entity. And then you'll find, this one is kind of crazy, but the lobbyist that's the chairman of ALEC's committee here in town, actually, when one lobbyist tried to get into a Cincinnati Reds game event with $1,000, wanted to know why he expected the amount of people to get in it for a lousy $1,000. So even the lobbyists are fighting with other lobbyists over the influence that is involved with ALEC. I want to remind you from our earlier report this year that in 2011, 33 bills were introduced in Ohio containing elements, and 64 different ALEC model proposals were embedded into law or into laws that were proposed. We went through the 7 deadly sins. I'll take you in a real short way through it. On the issue of envy, there was a fight over Lou Blessing and who got to go to dinner with Lou Blessing. It's gotten to the point where individual leadership members are being wined and dined and arranged according to how they want legislation and influence. This was all being arranged by a state employee. Gluttony. There was one email that talked about who needed a dinner on Friday. They were going to Antoine's. Antoine's is a restaurant in New Orleans, very fine restaurant. You can get a full meal for $152.75. Sean Dubb's lobbying firm sponsored a cigar night at something called the Mount Rushmore of bars at this very event. Greed, Cincinnati Reds ticket. You've got evidence that 3 people wanted to get into a Cincinnati Reds game for $1,000, and the lobbyist who's in charge of it said, well, who approved them getting to send 3 people for a lousy $1,000? Lust. One legislator, this wasn't enough for. He not only had his family there, but he wanted to know from the state employee who was arranging all these things why his family couldn't go to the Kings Island at a Cincinnati event, why it was just the Reds game. Wasn't enough. Pride, telling people not to use ALEC model legislation, use different language. That went to former Representative Mecklenburg. Sloth, make sure that legislative sessions don't get scheduled on any of these days so we can have session when we need it for this entity. Wrath. They say they're getting around the ethics law, and they say the reason they're getting around the ethics law is because they're going to this general conference, and this general conference is about something that should be important to all legislators in the public interest. And yet we have emails talking about lobbyists who are talking about how they can deliver more our votes from John Adams, or legislator in this case, John Adams, saying he can deliver more votes from his 78th House district for Republican candidates, and that is why he wants to meet with certain people. Clearly, this is not the nonpartisan issue it was meant to be. Folks, since our last press conference on this issue, there have been 2 JLAC opinions. These opinions clearly state what the law is. They clearly carve a loophole, or tried to carve a loophole, for these events by saying that the dues money paid by the state legislature, so the majority Republicans can pay the dues, allow them to get around all ethics laws that have been in place since the 1993-94 pancake scandal, honorarium scandal, that put limits on the influence of legislators, what they could give, and put disclosure on it. They clearly carve exceptions to allow that to happen. They do not appear, however, to allow what was happening in Representative Adams' office with his aide to coordinate these luncheons or dinners or whatever they are. But more importantly, because of that, JLAC has a responsibility as an ethics body, whether it is covered by legislators or not. And it is governed by legislators. But our legislative inspector general has a responsibility to go back before these memos were issued and issue findings based on this behavior. There is a reason we passed laws that will limit influence of lobbyists to $75. There is a reason the law was written with an exception to allow people going to NCSL, which has members of both parties going there, or Council of State Governments, which all parties go to, and they are not partisan and they are not ideological. There's a reason that exception was written into. But the way this is happening, the sinful way this is actually happening, is that they are getting around the ethics laws in order to allow corporations to have influence, to wine and dine, to do everything that we tried to get rid of in the ethics laws in the early 1990s. So I'm calling on the Legislative Inspector General not only to investigate based on this report the behavior of the legislators involved in this and their staff, but should he decide that these are carved out exceptions and excuses in these memo forms, I'm calling on the legislators of the Legislative Ethics Committee to do a thorough review of all ethics laws in Ohio and end this loophole and restore government back to what it should be, which is giving people a voice in government, limiting the voice of lobbyists and corporate entities.